Hello everyone and welcome into our midweek show here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Happy Wednesday, like I mentioned, our midweek show to you all. And for today's show, it's quite simple. We're going to be going over Thursday Night Football pretty heavily today, starting off the general betting preview. Very interesting AFC North matchup, at least in theory. It sounds very nice. We'll also be looking at some player prop bets for this game, including my positional rankings for Week 12 today with my tight ends and my defense and special team units to look out for. And last but not least, going over, as always, my weekly shadow report, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups that I believe will define the week in fantasy football. But before we get into any of this fun stuff, I do want to remind you that if you want to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show, the network is perhaps the best way to support us and our work here at the network. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned. But if you do want to interact more directly with the show, we love hearing your comments here in the network and around the shows as well. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Like I said, great way to contribute and interact with the show at large. You can either go to our website even, gsmcpodcast.net, to leave a tip or donation, or do it through YouTube proper. Or you can just leave any questions, comments, or concerns you may have throughout the show. They'll pop up on my screen. I'll read them on air. Again, another way to get your opinions on air. I love hearing them as well. It just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let's jump into our first segment of the day here, starting off with tomorrow night's AFC North matchup. A feisty rivalry these past couple of years between the Steelers and the Browns. This game seems meaningless in theory, but yet again, it is one of those games that, on paper at least, seems like a fun proposition. You have Jameis Winston in prime time going up against one of the best defenses in the entire National Football League. And then Russell Wilson in prime time trying to get that deep ball going, his trademarked deep ball, with all these fun new weapons who seem rejuvenated by his presence on this team against a Browns secondary that a lot of people thought was going to be one of the best in the league, but simply have not played like they did last year, and definitely feels like they can be got this year a lot more easily. So I feel like this game, since it's a divisional game, since it's a primetime game as well, could be a lot more fun than people expect. However, Vegas does not share that same sentiment with me, it seems. This, from a betting perspective, does not necessarily look like the most appealing game because both of these teams are at different points in their season. The Steelers probably wanting to firmly cement themselves as a true AFC playoff contender, and the Browns wanting to see out the season and, at best, probably steal a game or two with the fun that Jameis Winston brings at the QB position. But this game, I don't necessarily think will be that game. In terms of betting, Pittsburgh is a 3.5 point favorite. The over-under is 38.5. Pittsburgh minus 200 to win. Cleveland plus 170. So as you can see, not necessarily a very generous betting structure for this game from Vegas. Because of the fact, like I said, even though this is a divisional game, it's not necessarily one in which a lot of weight is going to be placed. Let's say the Steelers do lose. I don't necessarily think, it's a bad loss in terms of where they stand in the AFC North. It could be a bad loss for seeding, but they have that tiebreaker again over the Ravens. And even though the Ravens have a pretty much easier schedule down the stretch, I would still favor the Steelers just because, like I said, that defense is something special and it put in its best performance last Sunday against the Ravens in that game. And as for the Browns, the most exciting unit that's going to be stepping onto that football field outside of that Steelers defense might just be these Browns receivers. What I've seen from them since Jameis Winston stepped in at the QB position is reinvigoration and kind of turning a new leaf in that Browns setup. As I remember, during the offseason, they bring in Jerry Jeudy thinking that he can kickstart his career in a new home, but throughout the year, he hasn't really looked like that receiver who they thought he would be. Elijah Moore, always been kind of that wide receiver 2 role, but never really had solidified that position. And of course, you had David Njoku, who everyone knows can be a premier tight end in this league, but just hasn't had the opportunity, whether through inconsistent quarterback play or just injuries as well. And then you had Amari Cooper, of course, who's now a Buffalo Bill. So, as you can see, this whole season has kind of been a revolving door at the receiver position for the Cleveland Browns. They haven't had consistency, but over the past couple of weeks, ever since Jameis stepped into this role as this kind of quote-unquote bridge quarterback, there's been more excitement surrounding this Browns receiving core. I really like what Jerry Jeudy did in that last game against New Orleans. I really think that David Njoku is still going to get a lot more opportunities in this setup down the stretch. And I feel like the high-risk, high-reward nature of Jameis Winston just elevates the squad because he's not afraid. He's not afraid to attack you, and it's something that's going to have to be a part of his game against this very tough, very fearsome Steelers defense. So look for the Browns receivers to try and make as much noise as possible, much like they've done over the past couple of weeks, to try and keep them in this football game. I really believe, and I forgot about another guy, Cedric Tillman, a younger guy coming into his own in this team as well. So overall, when you look at this Browns receiver core and what they've been through this season and what they've been through over these past couple of weeks ever since Jameis Winston stepped in, this is a really intriguing unit here. And whatever happens down the stretch in the long term, I feel like at least they know that these receivers are capable of functioning in an offense that functions for them. So it's just a matter of finding some modicum of consistency in the future for these receivers to operate. And so that's why I'm so high on them right now, because I see the talent on the field, and I see what a quarterback who's unafraid really does to this team. So that's why I'm really high on these Browns receivers. However, it is a very tough matchup, and before you know, you have to worry about the pass game. You have to worry about who's up front in that front seven for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Very fearsome, vaunted front seven. You have guys like TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Patrick Queen, their new acquisition this past offseason from the Baltimore Ravens, ironically. So ultimately, you're looking at a very tough mountain to climb if you're Jameis Winston and the Cleveland Browns, and a unit that's kind of come under scrutiny rather than being lionized, much like the Browns receivers have this past couple of weeks, is the Browns O-line. It's been heavily decimated. Guys like Jedrick Wills, Joel Bitonio, Wyatt Teller have not really played up to snuff, whether with Deshaun Watson or Jameis Winston, so this is going to be a very rough evening for them. However, the reason why I feel like this is going to be a fun game in nature is because it is a divisional game. I feel like, no matter what the Cleveland Browns are right now, they are a team that can play spoiler here. Yes, their defense, like I said, is nowhere near last year's unit, especially in that secondary, which scares me because on paper they should be the best unit in the entire football league. But I feel like since tensions are going to be high in this one, this is a really feisty rivalry, like I said earlier, that really brings out the best in these two teams. And I feel like, the Browns seem down and out, but really have been performing better under Jameis Winston's regime. I feel like this could be an opportunity for the Browns to just have a game where they have a lot of freedom. And I feel like it's weird to say that considering, the Steelers are the presumptive favorites in the AFC North now. They could be pushing and lobbying for that number one playoff seed. So, in retrospect, they're going to want to win these games, especially in the division, to ensure that A, they win the North, and B, are still in contention for that number 1 seed. But I still think you can't underestimate a Browns team that, even though they haven't won many games with Jameis Winston, they look a lot better. Because Jameis is that guy, like I said, who, unlike Deshaun Watson's, not tensing up. He's embracing this moment. He's embracing the narrative of being this guy who's willing to step in. And he's really helped this team in terms of culture, in terms of identity, find its footing. Even though, it's not a team that is going to contend anytime soon. And in 2025 and beyond, this could be a very different Cleveland Browns team, and for that matter, organization. They might just clean house at the end of the season as well. So, just to have this moment of seeming stability, albeit by losing, with Jameis Winston at the helm, goes to show that this Browns team is further along in whatever they think their project is than we initially thought. Because yes, Deshaun Watson might play another game in a Cleveland Browns uniform, but the pieces they have are still pretty nice. They're pretty functional when you can get them going in that system. And I like all of those pieces. So I'm really excited to see what they do against this Pittsburgh Steelers defense. But that being said, I just think that Pittsburgh's a better team right now. I haven't even talked about their offense in this segment at all, but I still think that Russell Wilson's going to want to take advantage of those deep shots of George Pickens. I still think, the defense is going to get to Jameis Winston more often than not. I still think, the Steelers are a true AFC playoff contender, and they're going to prove it in games like this down the stretch. And that's why I have to pick the Steelers to win outright. I'm taking the points with them. They just feel like the safest bet here, even though anything can happen in this division week by week. But I still have to take the Steelers. They just look like the more well put together team. Mike Tomlin's doing an incredible job coaching them, so I can't ignore that factor. Let me know what you think in the comments about this particular game here. Really interested to see how it all plays out. But coming up next, we stick with this game from a prop bets perspective. A lot of players and storylines in this one that I want to cover. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we start with our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you wish to interact with my show or other shows around the network more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. You can do 3 things actually, including going to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, to leave a tip or donation, or just do it through YouTube if you feel so inclined. Or you can just leave any questions, comments, or concerns you may have throughout the show in my comment section. I'll be able to read them on air. Just a great way to get your opinions out there if you wish, and just make this show that much better as well. Without further ado, let us get into that second segment of the day, sticking in the world of Thursday Night Football with Steelers-Browns, talking about some player props. Now, both of these teams have very interesting players on their offensive side of the football. For the Steelers, we already know what Russell Wilson means to this team, and we already know what his best traits mean to this team as well. Whereas on the Browns side of things, it feels a little bit more boom or bust, and actually surprisingly, seemingly a lot more boom with Jameis Winston at the helm, so to speak. But considering the fact that this is a divisional game, I wanted to give certain players the benefit of the doubt here, because I feel like there has to be some sense of consistency with certain players here, but also I feel like I'm starting to understand different narratives for both of these offenses. For example, I feel comfortable with Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston's prop bets I've selected for them just because I know what kinds of players they are and what their best traits are as well. But in terms of the skill position players, I try to be as nice as possible, but I also consider the fact that, hey, anything can happen in this game because of its divisional nature. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with the Steelers here, because I didn't necessarily spend as much time as I thought I would in the first segment on them, but I feel pretty happy about the understanding I'm getting from Vegas and from the nature of these players as well. Let's start off with Russell Wilson. Obviously, I'm going to pick the over here. And actually, it's not a high yardage total that Vegas gave him, only 208.5 pass yards, but I do understand why, because Russ is one of those players who isn't necessarily going to do anything fancy if it isn't there for him, but I feel like in this divisional game, he's going to want to prove that the offense can be more than just complimentary. He wants to prove that this offense can be explosive, and I feel like they're going to dial up a lot of plays there with Arthur Smith that take that deep shot to George Pickens. We're going to talk about a little bit later. But ultimately, I feel like Russell Wilson's going to want to prove a point here and say, I'm not the one that's going to hold this team back once we get into the playoffs. I can fully complement my defense here and put points on the board while doing so. So I'm taking the over here, minus 137 for him. It's a pretty safe bet for tomorrow night's game. Then let's talk about George Pickens as well. It seems pretty easy to assume that he's going to hit the over as well. And that's what I'm taking here. 66.5 receiving yards. I don't necessarily know why. Maybe it's because of the divisional game. But those certainly feel like low totals for these two guys. Because they're what make this offense tick, right? Russell Wilson loves having that vertical guy. That big, deep threat down the field that can win contested catches when 50-50 balls really threaten corners and safeties down the field. So I gotta think that George Pickens is going to want to do that against a Browns secondary that, like I said, hasn't been up to snuff this season. So at minus 137, I feel confident in terms of George Pickens in this game. And the last Steelers player that I want to talk about here is Najee Harris. He's been an interesting player in the Russell Wilson era of this season for the Steelers because since he's come in, Russell Wilson, Najee Harris's game has really elevated. Had, I believe, 3 consecutive 100-yard games to start off. I'm not certain if he has continued that streak. Most likely not, but I feel like, Najee Harris is a very important player for this team. However, someone has to suffer in this Pittsburgh Steelers offense tomorrow, and I feel like it's going to be Najee Harris. I feel like, if anything, the Browns are going to want to get that defensive front going. And they're not scrubs along the defensive front, so look for the Browns' run defense to actually shore up in this one and stop a lot of what the Steelers want to do with Najee Harris, which is get him out in space. I feel like that Browns front's going to create some havoc, and so considering the fact that, Russ is going to want to wait this one out and try and get Najee Harris going, I feel like he's going to get a lot of touches, but they're not going to mean much early on in the game. Maybe down the stretch he can get going a little bit more, but I feel like for tomorrow night's game, he's not going to be the focal point of their offensive game plan. So that's why I feel like perhaps taking the under with Najee Harris would be the safest bet for him for tomorrow night. And it's 137. Now let's switch to the fun side of things. with the boom or bust potential of the Browns offense. Now, I feel like this Browns offense could look either completely inept tomorrow or they can really shock some people in this one. Maybe not to the tune of winning outright, but look pretty consistent because I really have faith that Jameis Winston just being there has elevated this group, has reinvigorated it, like I said in that last segment. So I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt here, but also remembering this is a divisional game. It's against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have the best defense in your division. So I can't be too generous here. But I still wanted to have fun with it. Starting off with Jameis, I think he's going to hit the over here. 243.5. A little bit generous for this game, this matchup. But hey, it's Jameis Winston. He throws the football a lot downfield. He could have upward of 50 pass attempts tomorrow night if you really think about it. So I had to take the over here because he's just a fun player in prime time. What could happen? Anything can. So I had to take that attitude into account here for Jameis, even though we know it is a defense that's really going to put the pressure on him and want to prove that they are true contenders, not just to win the AFC North, but to win the entire conference. So minus 137. I'm just taking the free nature, the loose nature of what Jameis Winston brings to this Browns team and taking the over here. And in terms of David Njoku, though, I feel like David Njoku has become a very weird player for the Cleveland Browns. Because when I remember last year, when Joe Flacco came in, he perhaps had his best stretch of games when Flacco came in to the end of their season in the playoffs that he ever had in his career. And I feel like this year, they have never really gotten back to trying to make him more involved in this offense. But I really think he is a true star in the National Football League. However, I'm not sure the Browns think so. Because what's frustrating about him is because everyone knows that he can be an elite player in the system. They just don't necessarily go to him as often. I don't know why, but even when Deshaun goes down and you think that David Njoku is going to get more touches just because Kevin Stefanski can work with this quarterback and get him in play action much like he did in the Baker era and try and get Njoku open more as a result. But I feel like that kind of narrative surrounding David Njoku is now gone. He's now just a role player, I feel like, for this Browns team. So that's why I'm taking the under for him at minus 114 in this game. And I feel sad in doing it just because I know how talented of a player he truly is. But I think the Browns are turning a new leaf, right? When I look at the pieces they have, the skill position core, and if they really want to move on from this horrible Deshaun Watson deal in as swift a manner as possible, they have to evaluate certain players who they believe are the future. And right now, I'm not sure where David Njoku fits into their plans. So I can't really say it will translate to on-the-field success anytime soon for him, especially in this very tough divisional game. But a player who I'm really interested in, and the reason why I included him in this betting perspective here, is Jerry Jeudy. Because let's talk about his career trajectory so far. He was drafted by the Broncos. Everyone thought he was going to be a big play threat because of his speed and effectiveness down the field, but never really kind of came into his own, ironically, under Russell Wilson. Now moves to the Cleveland Browns, potentially to complement, what Amari Cooper does. Now Amari Cooper's out the door. Now, hypothetically, Jerry Jeudy is your leading wide receiver. And what does he do? Have a career day last week against New Orleans in that loss. So, his story really is an intriguing one and one that I think the Browns would like to tap into because he could be something for this team in the future, no matter who's the helm at QB or who's at head coach. And I feel like it was a smarter move than people think to bring him in. Because I feel like no matter which way you slice it, this team feels like they can build through the skill position groups. So Jerry Jeudy, someone I'm going to be looking out for, and I think he's going to score a touchdown in this game. So at plus 330, look for Jerry Jeudy to be an anytime touchdown scorer in this one. It's pretty much the most long shot of bets I have in this list here, but I feel confident that the Browns are starting to trust him a little bit more in the system now that they see where they are in terms of their rebuild. So look for Jerry Jeudy to be a focal point of what the Cleveland Browns want to do, not just this season as they play it out, but in the long-term future, because I really think he can benefit this team to the best of his abilities with his style of play. And if the Browns do end up taking a quarterback they want to develop in this year's draft, because they could go hand in hand with the growth of this football team going forward. So, even though it's a tough matchup, like I said, look for Jerry Jeudy to score a touchdown potentially in this one. So let me know what you think about this in the comments, because it's a very interesting game to examine. Divisional game, really excited for it tomorrow night at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time at least. But coming up next, we begin our conclusion of my positional rankings for this week with the tight end position. A volatile position that's kind of lost its luster but still could be important down the stretch for you in fantasy. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, we take a break from talking Thursday Night Football to transition into the conclusion of our positional rankings with the tight end position. Now, I must say this position has kind of lost its strength and luster a little bit over these past couple of weeks due to the fact that there haven't really been superstar tight end performances around the league. If you were to ask me week in and week out who would be the most consistent tight end, I really couldn't tell you, because what I envisioned this position would become from a fantasy perspective, like I said before the season, that young-old split in terms of generational gaps, hasn't really happened. I feel like there's been a tier of guys who seemingly have become superstars, and then a whole bunch of middle tier guys who you have to think are more week in, week out, matchup oriented players. And so I feel like my rankings throughout this entire season, and not just this middle portion of it, have been very balanced in terms of guys who we know are superstars and we know have looked good throughout the season, and guys who are more performance-based players in terms of matchups week by week. And so I feel like this week's list is highly indicative of that, and not for nothing, throughout the rest of the season, I think it will be the same way based off what I'm seeing. So without further ado, let's jump right into this very weird position here and try and make some sense of it. Starting off with a tight end who I can firmly put now in the superstar debate here at the position. It's Trey McBride in a very intriguing matchup for another divisional matchup against the Seattle Seahawks this week. I gave the Seattle Seahawks a lot of love this past 2 episodes, and now I got to give love to the Cardinals because I truly admire them, even though they are a divisional rival. So I feel like in this game, that tension's going to bring out the best in the stars on the field. I feel like On the Seattle side of things, we talked about what DK Metcalf could potentially do in this one, but I think Trey McBride can be equally as effective on the Cardinals side of things. He's, again, much like DK, a very physical guy that's going to challenge these Seattle corners in more ways than they've seen this season. I feel like since the Seattle Seahawks defense hasn't been as consistent as one would think after their strong start to the season, I feel like Trey McBride is a very special kind of player in this situation because of his physicality. And I feel like, Kyler Murray's going to want to play it a little bit safe to start, get into the flow of the game, see if it truly will become a shootout, and then try to open up the field. And Trey McBride can be a huge part of that early offensive game plan, extending it into the latter stages of the game because of the way he can stretch the field as well. He's not just someone who can exploit zone coverages and softer coverages, but someone who can stretch the field down the seam. So look for him to be a true matchup nightmare against the Seahawks, and someone I truly admire even as a Seattle Seahawks fan in this division. He's going to play a huge role over the next couple of weeks because the Seahawks and Cardinals actually play each other 2 times in the span of 3 weeks. So it's going to be very pivotal, that bit of series there. So Trey McBride's going to try his best to make sure the Cardinals win out in both of those games. So look for him after this bye to look very fresh in this one. Then for the second player, a guy who I'm putting firmly in the kind of mid-tier here. A guy who, week by week, may not be as effective as some other tight ends, but still can get the job done based off matchups. And that is Zach Ertz going up against the Cowboys this week. He is someone who I'm really intrigued by just because from what I've seen these past 2 weeks in the Commanders' offense, I feel like they haven't necessarily gotten to where they want to be, based off those 2 tough defenses they played in Pittsburgh and Philly. But I still feel like Jaden Daniels can be more effective as a short to intermediate thrower. And I don't necessarily think it would be to the detriment of players like Terry McLaurin and De'Ami Brown who can stretch the field, but I still think that their bread and butter can be in working that into their game by focusing more on the run and short passing game and then stretching the field vertically in latter stages of games. And this is where Zach Ertz came in. He actually had a decent day against Philly, 18.7 fantasy points, but I want to see him more involved in this offense than we've seen him this season. Because I did like this addition for them in the offseason, getting a physical guy who can exploit softer coverages. But I feel like they haven't really utilized him to the best effects. So look for, in this divisional matchup, for Zach Ertz to get going a little bit more. And for the Commanders to try and look a little bit more diverse in their offensive game plan this week. I feel like the Cowboys are a perfect defense to do it against because they do want to try and crowd the middle of the field, but they haven't been as effective as years past. So look for Zach to really open up and expand this Commanders offense again, whether it be through trying to exploit that zone coverage or just, trying to get Jaden Daniels calm and composed to start the game, because he has been a little jittery these past couple of weeks and he needs a game where he's stable more often than not. So look for him to be that guy this week, and as a result to see his fantasy numbers go up. I'm not saying it will be a consistent thing, but I still think Zach Ertz is a viable option week in, week out based off of favorable matchups. Then for the third guy, this is a guy who's kind of teetering on the edge of being a superstar caliber tight end, but because of this injury he had to start the season and how long he's had to sit out and now being reincorporated into this offense, he's in a weird place, but I think this matchup is going to prove how elite of a tight end he truly is. I firmly place him when he's healthy and playing to the best of his abilities in that superstar tier. Maybe not firmly in tier 1, but definitely a high-end tier 2 guy at the position. TJ Hawkinson going up against the Bears. Didn't have a big game against Tennessee, but not really many players for Minnesota on the offside of the football had a good game against Tennessee, which I know is a very tough physical defense to play against. But against the Bears, which is a defense that I feel like has slowly waned over the past couple of weeks. I was very high on them, but they've slowly started to let it slip a little bit. I feel like TJ Hawkins' experience and physicality and ability to open up the middle of the field for the Vikings is finally going to be seen this season. Because I actually was talking to my father about this a couple of weeks ago, who's a diehard Vikings fan. And he says TJ Hawkinson's return is going to resemble a lot more short to intermediate areas of the field, especially in the middle of the field, that will now be available to Sam Darnold. And so we haven't seen it yet, but look for this divisional game where things could get tense, and it's definitely going to come down to a few crucial moments for TJ Hawkinson to be a big part of what those moments mean for the Vikings in this one. I truly believe that this season can be righted for him. I feel like he can find his footing in the system. It's just that, this injury was very bizarre for him because of how severe it was and how it extended into the season. And finding a way to get him back involved intends to take time. But I feel like now is the time where he's finally ready to prove himself as an X factor in this Vikings offense. If so, watch out for the Minnesota Vikings in the playoffs, because if TJ Hawkinson's going, this offense could be clicking really nicely for Minnesota. So this is not just a guy who I'm taking because of the matchup. I'm taking because I want to see how he does in this pressure cooker environment. I'm taking him because I know what he's capable of, and he can do this for the rest of the season. So look for TJ Hawkinson to be an X factor, not just in this game, but from here on out for the Minnesota Vikings. And then the last player that I wanted to touch upon here is a guy who's finally had his breakout game in the NFL. Another one of those guys who, in this generational gap, could really have a say in how the position grows both in real life and in fantasy for the next couple of years. And this is a guy who is going up against another tough matchup here in a division that probably is going to be chalk throughout most of his career, but he's still a guy who I'm really high on throughout the rest of his career in Las Vegas, and that is Brock Bowers. Because I feel like, Vegas is a team that could have picked anyone in last year's draft, but Bowers is just someone who is positionless in nature, who can really affect the offense in so many positive ways, doesn't necessarily play like a prototypical tight end, and he's truly someone who, even if the next couple of years the Raiders are still cellar dwellers, is still someone who's going to have a huge impact both in real life and in fantasy. And against the Broncos, in these divisional games, anything can happen because I love this Broncos defense. I truly do. And I had just one of their best games of this past couple of games against Falcons and then against the Chiefs as well. So they've been known to shut down premier offenses this season. But I feel like Brock Bowers is just someone who, no matter who is at the quarterback position, can really just make the game his own. Even when his team is losing by a lot, whether they're winning by a lot, this is a guy who's a difference maker at the position. This is someone who I feel like a lot of people expected Kyle Pitts to be like. This is a guy who is a no-brainer person to build around if you're the Las Vegas Raiders. He's going to prove it in games like this. He had 31.3 fantasy points against Miami, his first breakout game, and now in a divisional game, amped up now, prime and ready to go yet again, with a new OC, mind you. He's really looking like someone who's ready to assume the mantle of one of the best young tight ends in the league. And when I look at other tight ends around his age and around his year, in terms of how they play this season and their injury history, most importantly, he's someone who can take advantage of that and really make this tight end position a great position from a fantasy perspective yet again. So Brock Bowers, look for him in this one to really continue his hot streak and truly cement himself as someone who you always are going to want to draft in fantasy at the tight end position. But let me know what you think in the comments about this segment. I really think this tight end position is going to get a little bit weirder as the season goes along, but I feel like that's a good thing for the position because that generational split may have, not necessarily been the best thing. Who knows? Because it didn't happen this season. But I feel like all of these guys who you may not have thought about from a fantasy perspective are now starting to come into their own. And so that's why I feel like this position is just so critical in terms of how you view fantasy. But coming up next, we conclude officially our positional rankings for Week 12 with the defenses. Talk about a position group that's gone from zero to hero. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about them.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of the show, we are going to be concluding our positional rankings for Week 12 with our defense and special teams units. This is a position group that I feel has gone underestimated and underrespected from a fantasy standpoint this season. I tried to tell you about this position beforehand, but I feel like, this is still a position group that gets a lot of flack just because, they're not the prettiest part about building a fantasy football team. However, these defenses this season have proven that if you're tough, if you're physical, in real life you can win football games, and potentially in fantasy you can do good things as well. And also, special teams is coming to light a little bit this year. We know that the defenses have looked really good, but how about some special teams units really stepping up these past couple of weeks? And I'm really excited to talk about this bunch because these are a lot of diverse defenses that, maybe haven't won a lot of games or maybe are in prime position to clinch playoff spots pretty soon. But all of them are just fun defenses who can generate points in real life and fantasy in many different ways. So without further ado, let's jump right into our final positional rankings of the week with my defense and special teams units. Starting off with the defense and special teams unit we mentioned in our last segment, kind of in a more negative manner than we ever have in the show, but Brock Bowers is a special player. But I still think the Broncos defense is going to shut down this Raiders offense outside of Brock Bowers. I do hope that Brock Bowers has a good game for fantasy's sake for all of you out there who own him. But I still think that the Broncos are just a vaunted defense. And even though we saw signs of life from this Raiders offense with the OC change, I just think the Broncos are a heater, man. They're a really special football team on both sides of the football. The offense really complementing this defensive play well. Bo Nix finally rounding into his own, looking like perhaps the offensive rookie of the year if Jaden Daniels continue to slide. But let's talk about the defense, man. As I always say, you may not be able to name many of the players on this defense, but they play like one of the best in the National Football League. Whether it be Riley Moss and Jaquan McMillian on the back end, Cody Barton and Alex Singleton at the linebacker position, Zach Allen up front, this is a defense of studs. And you don't even have to know their names to know that they've been being pretty consistent from a fantasy standpoint. 12 fantasy points last week against Atlanta. Kind of shocking considering the fact that they held them to 6 points, but it is what it is from a fantasy standpoint. And in some different leagues, potentially they scored higher, but it doesn't matter because this defense, I know, is special. And so I can't pass up the opportunity against an offense that I think can start to get going, but just, hasn't been consistent enough to sway me and convince me that against opposing defenses like the Broncos that they can put up points. So look for the Broncos defense to yet again continue to pleasantly surprise people. And then the second defense, this is kind of a matchups-oriented one. But this defense I feel like is going to get going on the stretch here because this is a very interesting team to monitor on the stretch of the season. They feel like they can be in contention to potentially snag a wild card spot, if not their division. And so this is one that I really think can ramp up the intensity in their style of play and really remind people of what they can be going forward. And that is the Bucs defense. This is their easiest test to date coming up after the bye against the Giants team that has benched Daniel Jones and is starting Tommy DeVito, who I still love, but we know he's not necessarily the best option right now for the Giants. And so I feel like this Bucs team got this bye at the perfect time for them to get healthy. Mike Evans potentially coming back for this one as well. And all these defensive players as well coming back. They suffered a lot of injuries in that last game against the Chiefs on the defensive side of the football and still were able to shut down the squad. And shut down that squad to certain effect, mind you. So coming up after this bye, in perhaps their easiest remaining game on the schedule, look for the Bucs to get right again. And I'm not going to say that this is a game that's going to really get them going because, like I said, they have a very tough schedule. I'm going to pull it up right now because it is perhaps the most brutal down the stretch for any team. Actually, it isn't. I keep on mixing up certain teams, saying that they have tough schedules, but the Bucs actually have one of the easier schedules. Now that I look at it, they have games against the Panthers still. They have games against the Saints still. So this is a very manageable schedule, and coming up after the bye will prove that. And will hopefully get this defense going because I know what they're capable of on that side of the football. Out of all the players they have, it's just a matter of getting them in the right mindset to make that playoff push because I know they can down the stretch. And sorry for that mix-up, but they do have the schedule to do it. So look for the Bucs to get going in this one against New York. Then the Packers. Let's talk about their defense because I always want to include a defense with a harder matchup than people think. And going up against the 49ers team that, yes, still has questions and concerns about the status of Brock Purdy. He did end up in the injury report, seen as day-to-day with his arm. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. But I feel like this Packers defense is a defense that I've kind of disrespected a lot this season, but I still have to appreciate what they do for you. In terms of generating takeaways, they're one of the best teams in terms of a fantasy perspective in that regard. So I feel like in this one, should Purdy not play, look for, and I actually don't know who their backup QB is, so I'm going to look for whoever the backup QB is. I'm going to pull up right now. Brandon Allen, hopefully. I feel like is going to have a lot of turnovers in him in this game. Hopefully Purdy does play in this game, and we get a nice little shootout here in the NFC. But if not, then this matchup for the Packers gets a little bit easier. That being said, I still think that Shanahan will find a way to make this a tough matchup. So I did want to kind of give this matchup a little bit more balance because these last two, I feel like, are easy picks in terms of a fantasy standpoint. So I wanted this to be more of the tougher test for this defense. But I still think the Packers D, whether it's Purdy or not, will stand out and shine in this week's matchup. And then last but not least, I'm going to pick a sleeper team here, something I haven't really done in terms of my positional ranking. I always pick 4 defenses that I feel should be viable starts for you week in, week out, whether it be based off matchup or just based off performance. But this team, I can't really pin down because I'm looking at this matchup on paper and I'm saying, well, this team should win this game. But then again, I think about the Texans and what they've done on the outside of the football. They haven't really convinced me that they can win games handily against opponents like the Titans. And that's why I'm saying the Titans defense could be a sleeper pick this week. I feel like, in games where they feel overmatched, they've really held their own and risen to the occasion. And they may not necessarily be the most appealing option out there from a fantasy perspective, but I respect them because of what they've been able to do to compensate for the ineptitudes of this team and organization overall. I look at the things they do to stand out and differentiate themselves from other bottom-feeding teams and their defenses. They really hone in on the run game as well. And while I said that Joe Mixon could be one of the better starts of the week for you at the running back position, it's going to be a tough task. Because when I look at the Texans' offense, he really is the focal point right now. He really is what makes this offense tick. Maybe Nico Collins get going again after this injury, but he really is going to have to carry the load for this Texans team. And if the Titans are intent on shutting down that part of the game and forcing CJ Stroud to make plays, that's where this kind of becomes an uncomfortable game for the Houston Texans. Because Stroud this season has proven that, yes, in stretches and spurts, he can look like the elite quarterback he was last season. But, much like last season, when he played teams who actually wanted to generate pressure on him, he struggled mightily. And so, I'm looking for in this game whether or not the Titans can limit Joe Mixon just a tiny bit and focus on getting to CJ Stroud. Because if CJ Stroud gets pressured, then potentially this Titans D can make things happen. I really admire them just because, as a team that's not contending this season, they really have made those games tough for opposing teams. Last week against the Vikings, a couple other games in their division as well, they've made very tough. And so this is a team that can bring a surprise if this defense really gets going and does what it does best. But let me know what you think in the comments, because I try to respect all of the defenses in the NFL, whether it be based off matchups or whether it be based off performance. Like I said, defense is starting to prove very important to how you build a fantasy football roster. And you want to have a good one, especially now as we're heading towards the fantasy playoffs. They're seemingly right around the corner, so you want to prepare for that, and you might want to do it through locking down a solid defense. So let me know what you think about this in the comments. But coming up to conclude today's show, as always, with my favorite segment of the week, my weekly Shadow Report, the key wide receiver, cornerback matchups that will define the week from a fantasy football perspective. We'll be right back to conclude today's show with that exciting segment. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our final segment of the day here on today's show, we are going to be doing our weekly Shadow Report. Like I mentioned, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups of Week 12 that will define your fantasy football week and potentially some last minute decisions you might want to make. Now, we've seen a lot of these matchups this season already before because we're getting into the divisional games and the feisty nature of those. So, potentially, these are matchups we've already talked about and we want to talk about them in a different light. But also, some matchups in which I feel like either the corner has a certain advantage that I want to acknowledge, or, the wide receiver feels like they can have a different story this time around in this matchups. So without further ado, let's jump into our final segment of today's show here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with our weekly Shadow Report. Starting off with the first matchup. I actually think this is the first matchup of these two this season. Don't quote me on that, but it is going to be an exciting one because I hold both of these players in high regard, even though they've kind of been disrespected over these past couple of years and haven't really had the opportunity to prove themselves. Especially the cornerback in this situation had a pretty bad season this year, has some injury issues as well this year, but this receiver has also been someone who's now had the opportunity to play really well in a system that really works for him. And so I really think this matchup is going to be intriguing this week. And that is Terry McLaurin against Trayvon Diggs in this divisional matchup in the NFC East. And what I really think matters here is the fact that Trayvon Diggs has not had the best of seasons. He's had some injury woes, and almost everyone on the Cowboys defense has had some injury woes. And as a result, this Cowboys defense really hasn't had the opportunity to strut their stuff this season. So this matchup does seem favorable to Terry McLaurin, but I'm giving Trayvon Diggs the benefit of the doubt here as well because he still is a respected cornerback in this league. And whether or not, this Cowboys team can be competitive enough to make this a game, which I don't think they will, Trayvon Diggs can make this a frustrating matchup for Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin's going to want to work on the perimeter, so he may not line up against Trayvon Diggs all the time. But I still think, it's going to come down to whether or not this Commanders offense looks a little bit different than what we've seen in that really great stretch for them after the bye. As Tapton says, Dallas's weak pass rush hurts Diggs, and I agree. But to a certain extent, I feel like there's something about the Commanders' offense that I want to see in terms of kind of staying within the structure of trying to hit that big play, but also trying to be a little bit more minimalistic so as not to put too much pressure on Jalen Daniels. As Tapton says, plus Daniels can go off script. He can, which I admire in him. But I do feel like, I want to see a more composed performance from the Washington Commanders after the disasters of the past 2 weeks where you kind of saw this team, like you mentioned, had to learn a little bit off script. So I want to see, a more complete game from Jalen Daniels, and that might include, a little less of the deep shot to Terry in this game. So even though Terry seemingly has the advantage in this one, just because of the excitement of this Commanders offense, explosiveness it brings, I still have to give Diggs the benefit of the doubt here just because he's a corner who can make it tough, whether or not Dallas's pass rush gets home, which I agree could be a major factor in this game. But from the perspective of this matchup, it is an interesting one on paper at the very least. So look for it to potentially define how you decide on Terry McLaurin this week if you own him. And then for the second matchup of the day here, I feel like this one is going to be a very popular one because this one already happened, Tyreek Hill versus Christian Gonzalez this season, but under completely different circumstances. Tyreek Hill was sans Tua Tagovailoa, so Christian Gonzalez was favored in this matchup, at the very least because Tyreek Hill didn't have someone who could throw him this ball. As Tap Children says, you like Reeler to start. I'm not sure who Reeler is. I believe you're probably saying Mr. DJ Reader or Eckler to start. I feel like he could be an interesting start against the Cowboys. I think that I did actually put him in my fantasy rankings this week just because I want to see this running game get going again. It feels like they went away from it for a little bit, Washington, these past couple of weeks, and really didn't play into all of their running backs' best traits. But Austin Eckler can be very effective against this Cowboys defense, especially in stretching it horizontally in the pass game, or just by being his usual explosive self in the run game, especially on early downs as well. So I think Austin Eckler is a very viable start for this week. Getting back to this matchup again, it's made a little bit more exhilarating, a little bit more fun to watch because of the fact that Tua's now playing in it, not, Skylar Thompson or Shanu Huntley. But it is worth noting that Christian Gonzalez has faced a gauntlet of receivers. Guys like, DK Metcalf, who was the only player actually who scored a touchdown against him. Hill. A lot of weapons. Devontae Adams as well. He's faced a lot of talented receivers in this league, but only given up one touchdown. And he can line anywhere, whether it be in the perimeter or the slot. So he's not going to be afraid of this matchup just because Tua is at the QB position right now for Miami and not Skylar Thompson like last time. But it is worth noting that Christian Gonzalez has this track record and this resume, no matter who's at the quarterback position for certain teams. And so, in this divisional matchup, which makes this game a little bit more tense, especially considering the fact that the Dolphins feel like they can make a little run at the playoffs here, look for Christian Gonzalez to want to shut down Tyreek Hill yet again by any means necessary. So I think that this matchup, while I think Tyreek Hill could have a decent game, don't underestimate Christian Gonzalez and his resume this season. And for the third matchup here that I wanted to address, this is one that hasn't happened a lot actually in retrospect, but still is a fun one to monitor just because I feel like this game's going to be a lot closer than people think. It's Justin Jefferson going up against Jalen Johnson in this matchup. Like I say, Jalen Johnson's shown up on this list a lot just because he's one of my favorite young corners to talk about. But this is a matchup, right, where out of all these divisional games, this one's going under the radar a little bit. But these are two teams that play starkly similarly, not necessarily completely similarly, but I do feel like that plays into Jalen Johnson's hands a little bit more than you think. Because when I look at the worst units here for both teams, the offenses, I feel like Sam Darnold has started to regress a little bit. And perhaps as a result, not necessarily try and open up down the field to Justin Jefferson as much as he did to start the season. So I'm not necessarily saying that I'm immediately indicting this offense, but I do want that to kind of stick in people's minds because this Bears secondary and defense as a whole is very competitive. And this Vikings offense has not looked like it's looked for large portions of the season these past couple of weeks against defenses that, are elite in nature, but still should have been beaten a little bit more handily by Minnesota. So this matchup just is made more interesting due to the fact that this Vikings offense feels like it should win a lot of matchups here and can dominate this game because of what I've seen from them. Could be a little bit more tense, especially because it, as again, is a divisional contest. All of these divisional matchups, all these wide receiver cornerback matchups that have happened so many times over and over, just becomes a kind of repetition for all these players to face each other. And that could play into some of these corners' hands here and really make you think about who to roster for your fantasy squad at the receiver position. But now I want to talk about perhaps the most intriguing matchup I picked, because this is a guy who I've chosen against a whole secondary really, because this is a wide receiver core that I can't really pin down or gauge. So I have to pick, one guy who I want to pinpoint here. And I don't really know how it's going to affect this secondary based off of the many other weapons in his offense surrounding him. But Jayden Reed going up against a 49ers secondary that I really think hasn't been as elite as people think or expected this season, especially with all the injuries to them. Hufanga and Ward sitting out for large portions of the season. Not even fully healthy, I think, in the back end as well. A lot of losses as well this season. I feel like Jayden Reed, this is his opportunity to step up and assume the mantle of wide receiver one for the Packers. I feel like a lot of people are growing frustrated with how to view Packers receivers from a fantasy perspective because of the depth there. But I feel like this game can be the game where Jayden Reed really steps up. And not for nothing, the reason why I said the 49ers secondary as a whole is because they've really been the most underwhelming unit in the entire National Football League, based off what we thought the way we're going to be coming into the season to now. And I can't necessarily completely blame the coaching here. I can blame the injury bug a little bit more as well. But it's something that I have noticed. And so Jayden Reed, even though he's not necessarily viewed as the wide receiver one by many people in the fantasy football landscape, or maybe even by Packers fans, he still is someone who I have to take into account as someone who can affect games, whether or not, secondaries really hone in on him and try and focus on beating the whole of the Packers instead of just one individual. So that's why this matchup is so interesting. But let me know what you think in the comments, because this will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name has been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole, or continue making yourselves available to the many ways you can contribute to interact with the show with YouTube. But other than that, like I said, we'll be back as always tomorrow, but I am out for today.